Picture this. It's the heart of World War II. Young soldiers, barely out of their teens, are thrust into the chaos of battle. They face enemy fire, the loss of comrades, and conditions we can barely imagine. But what if I told you there was another enemy they fought? A silent, invisible adversary that their own commanders didn't understand, and in many cases, tried to hide. This wasn't a secret weapon or a covert enemy operation. It was a battle being fought within their own minds. This is the story of battle fatigue, what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder, and how the greatest generation faced a mental health crisis in near total silence before World War II. The psychological toll of combat was poorly understood. In World War I, it was called shell shock, and it was often dismissed as cowardice or a lack of moral fiber. Soldiers suffering from tremors, nightmares, and severe anxiety were sometimes accused of malingering just to get off the front lines. The prevailing attitude was one of stiff upper lip. You were expected to be tough to endure, and to never show weakness. So, when World War II erupted, the military leadership, still holding onto these outdated beliefs, was completely unprepared for the psychological carnage to come. They thought that by rigorously screening recruits, they could weed out the mentally weak. They believed that courage was an innate trait, and that good soldiers simply wouldn't break. They were tragically wrong. As the war dragged on, from the brutal island-hopping campaigns in the Pacific to the relentless fighting in Europe, the number of psychological casualties skyrocketed. Soldiers were exhibiting symptoms that baffled their superiors: uncontrollable shaking, emotional numbness, terrifying flashbacks, and a constant, paralyzing fear. They were physically unharmed, but their minds were shattered by the relentless stress of combat. This was battle fatigue or combat exhaustion. The military's initial response was, frankly, abysmal. Men suffering from severe psychological trauma were often treated with contempt. In some notorious instances, high-ranking generals publicly berated and even physically struck soldiers in hospital wards who were suffering from what they called nerves. The message was clear: your suffering is not real. It is a failure of your character. This attitude only deepened the soldiers' trauma, adding shame and guilt to their already immense burden. They felt isolated, believing they were the only ones who couldn't hack it. The problem became too big to ignore. The number of soldiers being evacuated from the front lines for psychological reasons was staggering. In some campaigns, the number of psychiatric casualties was as high as 1 for every 3 soldiers wounded in action. The military was losing manpower at an alarming rate, not just to enemy bullets, but to this invisible wand. Commanders on the ground realized they had a crisis on their hands. An army that couldn't cope mentally was an army that couldn't fight effectively. This forced a slow, reluctant shift in thinking. The military began to establish forward psychiatric treatment centers just behind the front lines. The new approach was proximity, immediacy, and expectancy. They treated soldiers as close to their units as possible, as quickly as possible, with the expectation that they would soon return to duty. These centers were a far cry from modern therapy. Treatment often consisted of simple rest, hot meals, a chance to talk about their experiences, and sometimes sedatives to help them sleep without nightmares. The goal wasn't to cure them, but to patch them up enough to send them back into the fight. While this was a step up from being accused of cowardice, it was still a deeply flawed system. It treated the soldier like a broken piece of equipment to be quickly repaired and put back on the assembly line of war. It failed to address the deep, lasting trauma that had been inflicted. The personal stories from this era are heartbreaking. Veterans later recalled feeling a profound sense of isolation. They couldn't talk about what they were going through with their fellow soldiers for fear of being seen as weak. They couldn't write home about it because it would terrify their families. And military censors would likely redact it anyway. So they suffered in silence, haunted by the faces of the fallen and the constant thunder of explosions that played over and over in their minds. Many buried their experiences so deep that they wouldn't speak of them for 50 or 60 years. When the war finally ended and the soldiers returned home, they were celebrated as heroes. Parades were held, and the nation rejoiced. But for millions of veterans, the war wasn't over. They brought it home with them. They struggled to readjust to civilian life. The silence that was forced upon them during the war continued. Society expected them to be strong, stoic saviors of the free world. There was no space for them to be vulnerable, to admit that they were still terrified, angry, or broken. The term PTSD didn't even exist yet. They were just told to get a job, start a family, and forget about the war. Many men threw themselves into their work, trying to outrun their memories. Others turned to alcohol to numb the pain. Families were often torn apart by the inexplicable rage, emotional distance, and nightmares of men who were physically present but mentally still trapped in a foxhole halfway across the world. The true horror that their commanders had tried to hide and ignore had followed them home, and it was now poisoning their peace. The systematic study of these veterans' experiences after the war is what laid the groundwork for our modern understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder. It was their silent suffering that eventually forced the medical and psychiatric communities to recognize that trauma inflicts a real, identifiable, and lasting injury to the human brain and spirit. It's not a moral failing, it's a wound, just like any other. The story of battle fatigue in World War II is a powerful and somber reminder of the hidden costs of war. It highlights the courage of a generation that not only faced down tyranny on the battlefield but also fought a lonely, internal battle with very little support. Their experience teaches us the critical importance of mental health care, compassion, and understanding, especially for those we ask to endure the unimaginable. They were heroes, not just for what they did, but for what they endured, both seen and unseen. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story as important as I did, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into history. Your support means the world. See you next time.